given what you outlined in that New York Times op-ed, some would call it a moderate view for a Republican, as you say, a lifelong Republican. What do you make of Paul Ryan's budget plan?
Well, I haven't had a chance to review it in detail. I read his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this morning. Look, I think he's right that we are on an unsustainable path in our entitlement spending. We need to do something to assure the long-term integrity of these programs. But I think the message is still tilted towards, pull back on spending, pull back on spending. And I think we need a more balanced approach. We need to emphasize effectiveness, lowering administrative costs, getting more benefits directly to beneficiaries. But we also need to embrace a more balanced approach to spending versus revenues. And also have a positive message, especially on job creation. We're so focused on entitlement spending, and it is a serious problem. I don't want to discount that. But we need a broader message. Fundamental tax reform, infrastructure spending, those are the kinds of things that can help level the playing field for the lower and middle classes and create jobs in the process.
But is Paul Ryan's plan so extreme and so far from the middle? Could one construe it as possibly pointless, since we need to get to that middle ground to really get anything done as we're in this just gridlock state?
Well, yes, finding the middle ground, finding the working center, that middle working majority coalition has been elusive for both sides of the political spectrum. And, you never start in a negotiating position from where you want to end up. So I'm assuming that I'm hoping that there is some give there. But I do think we have a larger problem with the Republican Party of the messaging, and we are so too heavily focused on reducing spending programs that, let's face it, primarily benefit the middle and lower classes. That's not to discount the serious problem we have with entitlement and spending. It is a very serious problem, and it needs to be put on a more sustainable trajectory. And I think people who want to defend those programs against any changes are not doing good service for older Americans, and most importantly, our kids, who are going to be paying for this if we don't get it under control. But it needs to be a broader message, and I think so. Yes, on one sense, we're posturing for a negotiating position here, but also we need to be mindful of how the larger country is viewing us, and it's not viewing us very favorably right now.
Sheila, as you point out in this op-ed we've referenced in the New York Times, it's not just what you mentioned, the threat that programs benefiting the poor and the elderly may be gutted, but also policies that appear to favor the wealthy, widening the divide between the haves and the have-nots. There is a wide-held impression that the Republican Party, that the GOP favors policies that benefit the wealthy and the upper middle class. Is that true?
Well, I think there is that perception, and I think some of the things we've done have fostered it, unfortunately, and we do. Look, we have traditionally pride ourselves on growing the pie, not redividing the pie. But right now, we need to acknowledge that there's some government policies that divide the pie in a way that favors people who already have a lot of money and investment income.
I'm sorry, Sheila, to interrupt you, but we want to take everybody to Paul Ryan live. We're going to listen to him for a few minutes. The Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan speaking from the Capitol in Washington, D.C. about his brand new budget proposal.
That's the basic acknowledgement when you're budgeting, just like families and businesses do, that you cannot continue to kick the can down the road, that you cannot continue to spend money we just don't have. Now, how do we do this? We cut wasteful spending. We repair the safety net so that we can help those in need. We protect and strengthen key priorities like Medicare, a program that's going bankrupt, that's jeopardizing the health security for millions of American seniors. And we foster a healthier economy so that we can create jobs and grow more wages. You see, balancing the budget is not simply an act of arithmetic, not just getting expenditures and revenues to add up. Balancing the budget is a means to an end. It's a means to a healthier economy, a pro-growth society, a pro-growth economy that delivers opportunity. That is first and foremost why we are doing this. Now, let me walk through a few of the charts if I could. And if this thing works. There we go. Now, here is essentially what we do to begin with. This budget cuts spending by $4.6 trillion over the next 10 years. Historically, we've paid a little less than 1/5 of our income to the federal government, but the government has historically paid a lot more, spent a lot more. We match revenues with expenditures. So our budget matches the spending with our income, just like every family and business must do throughout America. In fact, we bring our deficits down right away. This shows you how our deficit path goes down precipitously to begin with, to the point where we end up with a surplus in 2023. Now, in the 1990s, Democratic President worked with a Republican Congress to balance the budget. This is a goal that both parties have been able to achieve consensus on achieving in the past. We think it's something we ought to do again. Number 3, this is the picture that should scare everybody. This is the picture that shows you the path we are on today. We know, without a shred of doubt, we are consigning the next generation to an inferior standard of living. We know, just like in Europe, we are facing a debt crisis in this country. And a debt crisis hurts everybody. But the people who a debt crisis hurts the most are the poor, the elderly, the people who need government the most. They're the ones who get hurt the first and the worst in a debt crisis. And so what are we doing? We are addressing the most predictable economic crisis in this country's history, this coming debt. The red line shows you the path that this country is on right now. The green line shows you the debt reduction path that we achieve by putting this budget into law. Not only will we balance the budget, we will pay off our debt so that we give our children a debt-free nation. And doing that helps grow our economy as well. At this time, I'd like to turn over to one of the distinguished members.
Paul Ryan speaking live in Washington, presenting his budget, promising that if passed, it would balance the nation's finances in 10 years. Let's return to our conversation with former FDIC Chairman Sheila Bair. Sheila, I'd like to allow you to finish your point. We were talking about the perception and perhaps the reality that policies fostered and proposed by those like Paul Ryan don't do enough to narrow the inequality gap that we should add. The president has been talking about, and other Republicans have been talking about as well.
Right. Well, again, I think he's right on we need to constrain, we need to put the entitlement programs on a sustainable path. There are different ways to do that, but he's right to make that a very important issue. But it needs to be a broader message. And I think on tax reform, we've given lip service to fundamental tax reform, but in terms of getting at specifics, and the specific I would put at the top of the list would be taxing investment income at the same rate as wage income. I wish Mitt Romney, when people were making an issue out of him paying a 14% tax rate, saying, you know what, that's not right. You know, what a policeman or a school teacher does is just as important as what I did at Bain, and we should all pay the same rate. That would have really been a message that would have resonated with the general population. But I do think we need to, again, broaden our appeal and understand that a party focused on the 1% is a party that's mathematically unsustainable. We have to broaden our message and start giving the middle class, those who aspire to better things, the traditional Republican constituency, we need to give them some hope again.
Sheila, every time we raise that point about carried interest and investment income, the tax rate
Yes.
For it, with people on the receiving end, which is to say people who run private equity firms, they say, oh, we're happy to give it up, provided it's part of broader tax reform.
Right.
The reality, at least at the moment, appears to be that we're not going to get fundamental tax reform anytime soon. So what do we do?
Well, look, I think carried interest is just completely indefensible. And I agree with them. I would like to see fundamental tax reform, but at least take care of this very special interest provision. If you just focus on carried interest, it doesn't raise that much revenue. It's really more just an issue of tax fairness. But why can't we get fundamental tax reform? We should be able to get fundamental tax reform. We did it in 1986. It had a tremendous beneficial impact on the economy. It simplified people's tax calculation. It made them make more efficient economic decisions. They got frictions out of the system because of the skewed way that the tax code had influenced economic decisions. We can do that again if we have the political will. Everybody gives lip service to it. Domenici, Rivlin, Simpson, Bowles both had very good blueprints that were very similar to each other about how to get it done and raise revenues in the process and tax investment income and wage income at the same rate.
Dodd-Frank is such a point everyone loves to argue about. It is still not completely written. At this point, should it be tossed? Have banks simply worked their way around it and even outsmarted it?
No, I don't think it should be tossed. I think the tools are there. The key has always been with Dodd-Frank is how that the rules are implemented. And I think on too big to fail, I agree a lot with what Mr. Fisher says, but I do think that the regulators have a lot of authority to accomplish those objectives already if they use those tools. I do worry, though, that if we have a big jump ball and everything goes back to Congress again, it's another 2 or 4 years before a bill gets passed. In the meantime, nothing gets done.
So, Sheila, what happens next? I would have to imagine that those people inside the GOP who have a view that banks are the largest banks are too dangerous. Seek out your opinion on this subject. And we just witnessed the unthinkable David Vitter and Elizabeth Warren agreeing with each other on the risks that banks pose to the financial system during Ben Bernanke's most recent testimony. What is to be done about this problem if Richard Fisher and Harvey Rosenblum are right?
Well, I think there are a couple of near-term things that would do a lot to help. One is to get the capital requirements up. We still haven't changed the capital rules. Theoretically, you can fund your assets with 2% common equity. That's a ridiculous amount of leverage, and obviously the banks are not nearly that leveraged, but the rules allow that to occur. So changing the capital rules, have a simple, effective leverage ratio. We've suggested, a group that I chair, the Systemic Risk Council, has suggested at least 8% of a bank's assets be funded with common equity. Some would go up to 10%, 12, 15, 20, but even that would be a significant improvement over what we have now. Leverage was a key driver of this crisis, and I think both Republicans and Democrats agree on that. Also, forcing large banks to issue more long-term debt and reduce the reliance on short-term debt. Dan Torello has made suggestions along those lines that would have tremendously a beneficial impact on stabilizing their balance sheet, stabilizing their funding and their liquidity, forcing them to fund long, which would give them a better way to manage interest rate risk, but also, frankly, it would increase their funding costs and create better regulatory parity between the large banks and the small banks.
But unless I'm mistaken, what you're talking about is finding ways to protect the financial system and ultimately taxpayers from the banks as they exist today. Do you agree that the largest banks are too big and should be made smaller one way or the other, whether it's by regulation or through some shareholder action?
I think, well, definitely through shareholder action. I think that the issue is not so much size as complexity and interconnectedness. Another thing that the regulators could do, that they have the tools to do, is require better disclosure. These banks are black boxes, so even when shareholders see them underperforming, and Citi and B of A have performed terribly, and that was true even prior to the crisis, they can't get the information they need to figure out if they're worth more in pieces, and make them disclose how they allocate capital expenses among their various business lines. They don't do that now. So just getting more market information would empower shareholders and create a lot more market discipline. So I don't want to discount the broader, more aggressive measures, ambitious measures to break them up. I think that's very difficult at a practical level to figure out how to do that. And if you look at Lehman Brothers with $600 billion in assets, that's a lot smaller than what people are talking about in terms of capping size. So I think focusing on more, complementing good regulation with market-driven incentives to downsize them is really the way to go. And convincing the market that too big to fail is over. Convincing bondholders and shareholders that their money is going to be at risk of loss if one of these guys goes down. That would be a tremendous boom. But right now, as we see in their advantageous funding costs, the market still thinks that the government's going to bail them out.